Hi, welcome. We're now in Unit 1 of Teaching English Across the Disciplines. My assumption is at this point that you've already watched the welcome message, and if you haven't, you might want to go back and watch that before you watch this introduction, because it's really, the information I give kind of comes right out of that. So really what I want to do, because in this first unit we're kind of building up a shared foundation, a general understanding, I want to talk to you about, well, how do the challenges for English language learners differ across the disciplines? In other words, what are we going to be paying attention to as we look at math and science or social studies and language arts? So what I've got here is I've got 8 of them, that these are what I find in my own teaching and in my own research. These are what I see as mattering in terms of differences. I'm going to walk you through them, and then I'm going to be quiet for a moment, and I want you to just in your mind make some predictions, or stop the video and just make some predictions about what you think I might say about them. So we have vocabulary differences across the disciplines, abstractness, variety, grammar, visuals, demonstration of understanding, subjectiveness, and culturally shaped perspective. So either stop the video or just pause for a moment and make some predictions about what you think I might say about these. Okay, so one reason that I have these laid out in the way that I do is because in my mind, vocabulary, abstractness, variety, and grammar really have to do with linguistic challenges, language challenges that English language learners experience. Visuals, demonstration of understanding, subjectiveness, and culturally shaped perspective, for me, these are principally cultural challenges. So let's walk through and see how what I have to say matches up or doesn't with some of the predictions that you made. Well, I think if most teachers were asked, what is the challenge for English language learners in your classroom, especially if they had very little theoretical background in this area, I think the first thing, and maybe the only thing they would talk about, is vocabulary. So what are the differences across the disciplines? I mean, shouldn't vocabulary simply be challenging across all of the disciplines? Well, there are differences. For example, in some of the disciplines, in one chapter, or even on one page of a chapter, students will just encounter 1 or 2 new vocabulary items. Whereas in other disciplines, it's quite prevalent that every page will introduce 7, 10, 15 different new vocabulary items. And when I say new vocabulary items, I don't just mean for beginners in English language learning, but I mean for any student who's learning that discipline. They too, whether they're native speakers or not, they would be faced with many, many new vocabulary and concepts to master. So that's a big difference. Another difference is, does the vocabulary that's used, is it mostly BICS? Is it mostly CALP? Is there a mixture of the two? And for those of you who have not taken Second Language Acquisition yet, the ESLG 480 course, basically BICS means, in shorthand, everyday language. The language of buying a hamburger, the language of asking your roommate how their day was, the language that you use to ask politely for something. And CALP is academic language, the language that you are using when you are writing a science lab report, or you're reading a social studies chapter, or you're writing a paper for your English class. All of those are evidence of CALP. And so what we see across the genres is we see different amounts of these used. And one thing that we can be on the alert for, in some genres, CALP items are used, BICS items, that everyday language shows up in the discipline and now has a different meaning. And so for English language learners, that can be quite a struggle, because when they see a page of text, they might recognize words, but the problem is now they have a completely different meaning. They have a discipline-based meaning. So that's a very different challenge of vocabulary. And in some of the disciplines, students might be able to draw upon more cognates from their first language. So if a student is, for example, a Spanish speaker and has learned English as their second language, there might be more cognates that they can draw upon in one genre than another. So those are all elements of the way vocabulary can be drastically different, the challenge for English language learners as they move from math to science to social studies to language arts. Another challenge that's quite different across the disciplines is the level of abstractness. So how abstract are the concepts that are being tackled? And another way that that abstractness kind of plays a role in the disciplines is for pedagogy. When we are attempting to take that abstractness and make it concrete for English language learners, which by the way is a theme across all 4 disciplines, finding a way to make the abstractness concrete. What works from one discipline to another is extremely different. So our pathways in responding to the abstractness is quite different from discipline to discipline. I have here variety. And by variety, what I'm referring to in part is how the language students experience within that discipline varies from moment to moment. In some disciplines, when students read a textbook chapter, they're moving from one genre to another. They're moving from one dialect to another. And again, what does dialect mean? I'm drawing here upon from some learning you did in 480, Second Language Acquisition. A dialect is a form of language that comes up in a geographical area. An example that I've talked about in a couple of courses so far of dialect is I speak when I'm at home, I speak an Indiana farm dialect that I grew up with. And to you right now, I'm speaking a very formal academic dialect or discourse. So one way that variety plays a role in the challenges that students experience is in terms of how quickly they are expected to recognize a change in language, to recognize a change in discourse, a change in dialect, a change in genre, how quickly they're expected to do that and recover and to be able to understand it. Another way that variety plays a role, in some of the disciplines, students are exposed to drastically different levels of language. So on one page of text, they might encounter language that is 2 steps above their English proficiency, and yet on the same page, language that's 2 steps below their proficiency. And so that's another way that the disciplines can change from one to another, and that's something we're going to be on the lookout for as we explore our 2 disciplines. Grammar. This one plays, and I kind of like that I have it here in the middle of the board, because this is going to play a huge role in the ways that we notice the differences in language. And we will, in 2 lectures, I will be talking to you about something called grammar clusters, which is actually this idea that within a certain discipline, there are certain types of grammar that show up again and again. And there's certain kinds of grammar that hardly ever show up in that discipline. And although it's kind of a challenging concept to get into, I think I do a good job of it in this course, but it's kind of a challenging concept. It really empowers us as teachers, because what that means is we can look ahead at a short story. We can look ahead at a science lab experiment that our students are going to carry out. We can look ahead at the math worksheets we're going to assign for class for homework tonight. And we can see what is the grammar that students are going to have to be able to understand and possibly even produce to carry out this task. So grammar changes drastically from one discipline to another. So we'll be paying close attention to that. So those four that I just talked about, those are, in my mind, principally linguistic challenges that students will be challenged with across the disciplines and that we'll be paying attention to. And now start the ones that I think of as more principally cultural issues. So one I have up here is visuals. If you took second language acquisition, ESLG 480 already, you might be a little surprised to see visuals up here, because we tend to think of visuals as a help. We tend to think of them as a way to assist students. It's a way to contextualize things for them so that they can understand. A word you might not have heard yet, but it's very key in our profession, is multimodal. So besides students hearing it, they can see it. But here's the thing. Something you might not have ever thought about is that when we put a visual in front of students, they really have to interpret it in a cultural way. So for example, if you're flipping through a textbook in one of the disciplines and there's an actual photograph, it's not a chart, a graph, a table, it's just simply a photograph, the discipline will determine how students are expected to interpret that photograph. Isn't that surprising? We think of photographs as being, it's a way to support students. It doesn't have to be interpreted, and yet it does. Because in some disciplines, a photograph means this person or this particular thing. And in other disciplines, a photograph means this is just an example. Or sometimes this is just setting the scene, So visuals, even if photographs, can be understood in drastically different ways. And so we have to assume that if students' cultural experiences, especially their educational experiences, have been different to this point, they are very likely to not interpret them the way that we're expecting them to. And so visuals, in a discipline, there might be only one kind of visual that's used over and over again, or there might be quite a variety. And there might even be extremely different ways that students are expected to interpret visuals, even within the same discipline. So that can be quite a challenge. So when you see visuals, think to yourself, how are students going to culturally interpret this? And how can I support them with any misunderstandings they might have? Another cultural piece I have here, another challenge, is demonstration of understanding. So one thing that we'll see across the disciplines is that we often ask students to demonstrate to us that they understand the content, and we put different kinds of assessments in front of them in terms of the discipline, how the discipline expects students to show their understanding. Now, why is this a cultural thing? Well, it's quite cultural because especially if students have experienced schooling in a different place, in a different culture, in a different kind of schooling system than the one that you're teaching in, it's very likely that they have learned to express their understanding in very different ways. Here's an example. If students are coming to you from a refugee camp, for example, they might have had no access to paper in all of their previous schooling. And so they have learned to show their understanding entirely in an oral way. Or they have learned to show their understanding with one-word answers, not with explaining their reasoning. And so if you are expecting students to demonstrate their understanding by writing long explanations, an essay or a paragraph, this might be a new idea for them. And they might not even have any experience in how you even explain what's going on in the mind, the steps that you're taking. And when I was growing up, when I was going to school, we were not expected to explain our understanding across many of the disciplines. Our teachers were simply looking for, did they get the right answer? Whether that was social studies or that was math, did they get the right answer? And so it might be new for your students too, for cultural reasons. So that is a way that disciplines can vary greatly from each other. Another is the role of subjectiveness. And what do I mean by this? I mean how the student brings their own ideas, how they bring their own creativity, how they bring their own critique to the discipline. In some disciplines, there is a huge focus on having students take the ending of something and change it, or come up with their own way of carrying out some function. And this might, just with the last parameter we looked at, demonstration of understanding, this might not be in a student's previous educational background. It might not be any part of their educational experience. And it might not be a part of their culture. There are many cultures around the world in which a child would never, ever give their opinion in front of an adult. And many cultures in which, as you are learning something, it's assumed that what you have to say about it is not of worth. It's only when you mastered something that your opinion matters. So this might be an incredibly new step for students to take as they're learning a discipline. And the way that we draw upon and ask for subjectiveness from students across the disciplines is quite different. Okay, last but not least, culturally shaped perspective. In some of the disciplines, the ideas that we put in front of students can only really be understood if they're interpreted in a specific cultural way. And so it's not that students can't understand that, but rather that it might be a completely new concept for them, a completely new perspective. They might come to your class, especially if they're new arrivals in the U.S., they might come to your class with very specific values that would actually take them in a different route than the ideas that you're putting in front of them that are a part of the curriculum and the discipline. And so one thing that we need to be on the lookout for is when we're putting concepts in front of students, that if you approach from a different cultural perspective, they really make no sense at all. In fact, that cultural perspective would take you in a different route. So some of the disciplines include these and some don't. So that's another thing that we'll be taking a look at. So once again, what did we accomplish in this time together today? What I really wanted to give you is I wanted to give you the big picture. What kinds of things are we going to be paying attention to? What kinds of things are you going to be exploring in the two disciplines that you've chosen? Social studies or language arts, mathematics or science. What are you going to be paying attention to? And when you write at the end of the quarter, when you write those two lesson plans, what kinds of things are you going to be paying attention to as you shape the instruction for English language learners? And what I've got here is I've got 4 that I think are principally linguistic challenges: vocabulary, abstractness, variety, and grammar. And then I've got 4 that I think of as principally culture: visuals, demonstration of understanding, subjectiveness, and culturally shaped perspective. Okay, so what I want you to do from here is I have a couple of readings that I want you to take a look at, and then I will see you in the discussion, if I haven't already seen you there this week, in which you will introduce yourself And there's a couple of steps to that, besides, of course, just telling us a little about yourself. Tell us which pathway you've chosen. And another step, tell us why this pathway is of interest to you. So don't just tell us that your major is English, so of course you're doing the language arts and social studies major, or you're a science major, and so of course you're following that pathway. Tell us why the discipline interests you, or why both of the discipline interest you the most, and then make a prediction. What do you think, especially when you think about these 8 different elements that now I'm hoping that you're already primed to pay attention to? For the disciplines that you've chosen, where do you think the biggest challenges are going to come from? Okay, see you in the discussion.